Last week we started a new theme. We began a brand new theme which will probably last for the next 3 months or so. And during the next few months what we're going to be doing is looking at a very useful and practical guide to the spiritual life, to the spiritual path, and it's called the 5 aspects of the spiritual path, or 5 aspects of the Dharma life. Sometimes it's called the system of practice, so it's got lots of different names, but it's a very important list. We're calling it 5 aspects of the spiritual path. And Bodhinaga introduced this last week and he explained that in a way what this is a guide to how human beings grow. It's what you can just see happening. If you see a human being growing, then these 5 aspects will be involved in that growth. It's a guide to, if you want to make progress, if you want to transform spiritually, then these 5 aspects need to be present. So you could say it's a universal list, but it's a list which has been formulated by Sangha Rakshita, who's the founder of our tradition. So it's very much a Triratna approach to the spiritual path. And Bodhinaga also drew out the differences. So we've got lots of lists. Last week, Bodhinaga said, we've got lots of lists. Why do we need a new path? Why do we need a different path? And he drew out, well, actually, if you focus on these 5 aspects, you may see that they involve internal change, they focus on the internal aspects of the path. Whereas maybe the Eightfold Path is more, we look at it more externally. That's one way of looking at it. And we're also going to look at this path through stories. So the theme of Sangha is called Stories of the Path. So for the next 3 months we're going to be looking at, we're going to be telling different stories, some Buddhist stories, some non-Buddhist stories, and using those to illustrate and draw out these different aspects of this spiritual path, the 5 aspects of the spiritual path. So last week, Bodhinaga talked about the Lord of the Rings, and he told, in a very short space of time, a big, huge, epic story, very, very well. And but he also drew out how you could see these different aspects in that story. And this evening, I'm going to look at the story of the Buddha, the life and the story of the Buddha, to draw out some of these same aspects. So why bother with the stories? Bodhinaga asked this last week. Why bother with the stories? You might be thinking, why can't you just tell us the list? Why can't we just have the list? Why can't we just have the information and get on with it? Why bother with telling us the stories as well? And hopefully what you'll find over the weeks to come is that through the stories, they bring extra juice in a way, extra juice, extra kind of oomph to the teachings. What happens is more of you will get engaged through hearing the story, hopefully through hearing the teaching through a story. It engages different aspects of us and brings those on board. So hopefully what you'll hear this evening, last week and over the weeks to come, is that you'll hear the teachings, not in a dry way, but really brought to life with more juice through the stories. Okay, so this evening, I'm going to be talking about the Buddha and looking at this path through stories of the Buddha. And there are lots and lots of stories associated with the Buddha. Lots of stories. There's stories associated with his quest before he became enlightened, before he became the Buddha. Lots of stories associated that we could go into just looking at his life before he became the Buddha. So he had 36 years of his life before he became the Buddha. So there's lots of stories before his enlightenment. There's also a lot of mythic stories, legends associated with the enlightenment experience of the Buddha that really draw out his inner world, his inner experience during that time. I'm not going to look at those either. I'm not going to look at the pre-enlightenment or the enlightenment stories very much. What I want to draw on mostly is just the Buddha as the end product, as it were, the Buddha after enlightenment, who really illustrates and shows us all of these 5 aspects perfected. So I want to kind of look at stories from the Buddha's life and see how these 5 aspects can be really perfected. And then also look at the Buddha's teaching and explore how we can cultivate them, how we can develop these 5 aspects. So I think that's one of the reasons I really love Buddhism, is because Buddhism doesn't just tell you what you should be. It gives you a real vision of the goal through the Buddha, but it also tells you how to get there. It tells you how to change, how to transform, to achieve that, to become like the goal. So with Buddhism you get the goal and you get the path, you get the teachings that show you how to become like the goal, to become the goal. Very, very, just before I tell the story of the Buddha, or some of the stories of the Buddha, just a question: how do we relate to the Buddha? And some of you might already have a relationship with the Buddha, some of you might not. So how do we relate to the Buddha? And it's important to be clear, well, the Buddha, we don't regard the Buddha as an idol or a god, we don't kind of worship the Buddha in that way. But hopefully I'll draw out through these stories that the Buddha is somebody to be revered. We do, as Buddhists, revere the Buddha. We revere the example of the Buddha, even if he's not alive, if he's no longer, if he's died. We still revere the Buddha, but we don't worship him as a god. And mysteriously, it may be that there is something of the Buddha's enlightenment experience that we can still contact, that we can still experience today, which is beyond space and time, which can sound very mysterious, but hopefully I'll draw on that a little bit through these stories. Okay, so the Buddha's own quest, the Buddha's own path, the Buddha's journey began with a vision. It began with a spiritual vision. So the Buddha was a human being like us, and he was dissatisfied, probably like us. The Buddha was dissatisfied with a life of luxury, probably very similar to us. And the Buddha was moved by suffering. He was moved by the suffering of people around him. According to the legends, he lived a very luxurious, very privileged life, but he was moved by the suffering of other people around him, the suffering of life. And he was particularly compelled to set out on his quest by a vision of what he could become. It said that on one occasion he had a glimpse of a holy spiritual man, a holy wandering man. And that glimpse was enough just to awaken in him this urge to go on a spiritual quest, to discover the end of suffering. So he was compelled by this vision of what he could become, to go on a quest to end suffering. So we've all looked at the Eightfold Path, some of us on the intermediate course recently, and we can see, well, the spiritual life often begins with vision, a vision of what we could become. But we need to act on it, we need to act on that vision, for it not to just become a memory or a regret. We need to act and be moved by, we need to act on that vision. So the Buddha was moved to act, and he left completely his life, his luxurious life, his privileged life. He left his young family and just left everything, his whole identity, and went out on a new quest, a quest just to discover the end of suffering. And I'll talk more about that later. To cut a long story short, he was successful, but I'll talk more about that later. I want to just pause on this decision to act, and this going forth, this decision to act on his vision, to really act on it, to be moved to act by it. And I want to ask a question. How many people set themselves some kind of New Year resolution for this year? Put your hands up if you've decided you're going to do something differently, some kind of New Year's resolution for this year. Okay. And keep your hands up if you've kept it successfully, or if you're still doing it. Okay, well done. So that's quite a few people have done, but also some people like me haven't done. And what we need, if we need to act on our vision and be successful, we need to engage our emotions, we need to transform our emotions, we need to engage the whole of our being behind our vision, behind our decision to act. The whole of us needs to be behind it. So this is where the spiritual path begins. It begins with integration, this first aspect of the spiritual life. And that, integration consists of getting our emotions behind our vision, behind our decision, becoming really wholehearted about our quest, wholehearted about our decisions, our commitments. So when we're unintegrated, when we begin the spiritual path, and for most of us this is where we begin for quite some time, we can try and make a commitment, and it can feel as though actually we're not the same person who made that commitment a few days later. So, for example, you might decide and really mean it that you're going to meditate every day. And I've done this in the past. I'm going to meditate every day. I'm going to give up chocolate. I'm never going to eat chocolate again. Lots of different things I've decided I was going to do. And then a few weeks later, maybe a few days later even, maybe even later that day. Unfortunately. It's as though a different person had made that decision. Why did we make that decision anyway? It no longer seems like an attractive thing to put our life behind. And it can feel like we're not, when you try and do this repeatedly, you get the experience that it's as though you're not one person, you're almost like a set of different people. And depending on which person is in charge at that particular time, you're quite a different person. And sometimes in different situations, we can experience ourselves as different people. You might be one person at work, another person around friends, another person with family, another person at the Buddhist Centre. So it's almost like there's lots of different parts of us competing for control in a way. And when they're not in harmony, when they conflict with each other, it's very, very difficult to commit and stick to it, to act and follow it through. Just a story from, not the Buddha, but from my path to illustrate this. And we're talking, so must have been about 8 years ago, because the previous chair, who was the chair at that time, was a friend of mine called Bodhinaga, and he was looking to pass on his responsibilities of chair at the time. And I still meet up regularly with Bodhinaga, and I was doing then. And at the time, I don't know if I offered to help or if he asked for help, but he's saying he was looking to hand on some of his responsibilities. So my eyes kind of lit up, and I was thinking, oh great, I'm going to get some kind of, I want some, I think I'm ready, I've been at the Buddhist Centre for a year or two, I think I'm ready for some kind of big responsibility around the centre, something big, maybe I could be the chair, maybe. So Bhagavan said, yeah, I'm really looking for tandem responsibilities. Could you be the person who changes the light bulbs for me? Could you change the light bulbs at the centre? And my heart sank, because it wasn't what I wanted. I didn't, I wanted something prestigious, something with a lot of status behind it. And changing the light bulbs wasn't really the job I was looking for. I said, I'm on the spiritual path, I can do this. So I accepted the job offer kind of as wholeheartedly as I thought I could. Really meaning to do it. And the first weekend I came, I got a ladder out and I changed a couple of light bulbs at the centre. Felt very good about myself. And I never did it again after that. I never ever changed the light bulbs since then. I don't think I have changed the light bulbs since then in the last 8 years. So basically what I learned something very valuable about myself. I learned that I actually wasn't as far along the path as I thought I was. And I learned that, there were bits of me that, bits of me that wanted to be a Buddhist, wanted to be ethical, and there were bits of me that wanted, a high status position, to have prestige. And there's all these different parts of me, and it wasn't always clear why I was making it, why I was doing something, what was motivating me to do something. But actually, through committing and failing, I learned about myself. I learned more. I got a more accurate perspective of where I'm at, and that's what the stage of integration involves. It involves kind of getting real about yourself, starting to learn about yourself, to know yourself, and to, in a way, get to know where you're really at on the path. And it involves, getting all these different bits of yourself in harmony, kind of coordinated and in awareness. So they're not, in a way, there are bits of us that we may find a bit ugly. We might be a bit almost in denial about. We might have kind of jealousy, hatred, rage, kind of lust, all kind of stuff that we think is a bit kind of grotty and not Buddhist. And sometimes we're just a bit blind to it, completely blind to it. We can see it in other people. It's really clear in other people, but we just can be quite blind to it ourselves. And this stage involves getting to know the different parts of us and getting them into relationship with each other, getting them into harmony with each other. So how do we do this? A bit about how to do that. So a very important aspect, practice involved with this aspect of integration is mindfulness, the practice of mindfulness and awareness. So through particularly the mindfulness of breathing, but just day-to-day mindfulness as well, you start to become more and more aware that you start to bring light into these kind of shadowy areas. You start to become more aware of just the different aspects of yourself, the different drives, the different motivations. And it's almost as though in the mindfulness of breathing, you can kind of take a step back and just see the contents of your mind, see the contents of your heart more clearly, and just start to bring them more into the open, more into relationship with each other. So mindfulness is really important, and it's significant that the Buddha was doing the mindfulness of breathing at the time of his enlightenment, when he was kind of just integrating on a massive scale. It was the mindfulness of breathing that the Buddha was doing as a meditation practice, apparently. Another thing you can do to work with this aspect is to commit to things, but not just to commit to things and not do them like I did, but commit to things and stick to them, see them through. So, and a very, very good thing to try and commit to is the 5 precepts, actually. If you try and commit to the 5 precepts and try and see them through and act according to them, well, you very, very quickly learn about yourself. You very, very quickly learn about the different sides of yourself, the bits of yourself that do want to practice the precepts, and the bits of yourself that actually are not interested in practicing the precepts, to be honest. So yeah, if you commit to something and stick to it, then you learn about yourself, you learn about the different sides of yourself. Okay, and then what can happen? I want to give a glimpse of the Buddha. What can happen when we really do completely integrate all these different aspects of ourselves? What can that be like? Well, it said, and the Buddha had to overcome really, really strong forces of hatred, jealousy, greed, lust. The story of his enlightenment experience is a story of a real struggle with all these inner forces. But what happened, what the Buddha did and what happened, might surprise you if you're new to Buddhism, or it might still surprise you. In Buddhism we don't cut off all our energies that we see as negative, but we harness them. Part of integration involves harnessing these different energies, and they're transformed through the different aspects of the path, which I'll talk about. But the Buddha harnessed all the different energies and transformed them. So the Buddha with a fully integrated consciousness had a really powerful presence, a really potent mind. It said that, in a way, an unintegrated mind, a distracted mind, is a bit like a butterfly mind. It just kind of flits from one thing to the other, gets distracted by one thing, flits to another thing. And the Buddha was described as having the gaze of an elephant. If the Buddha turned to look at you, it's as if his whole entire being just looked at you, just took you in. And it said it's the way that an elephant just turns its whole body and just looks at something. The Buddha would just really, his whole being would just turn and look at you. And I've had a taste of this with a friend of mine who's kind of much further down the path than me, just asking me, Padma asking me a question, which I wasn't sure I wanted to answer truthfully. He just asked me. It was almost like his whole attention, his whole being had just kind of looked at me. I just had to tell him the truth. And I was just terrified. If you get somebody who's this really potent presence, this really strong, powerful mind, it can be very, very intimidating, actually. So the Buddha, you can have the sense of the Buddha sometimes as being maybe a doormat or something, some kind of very calm, peaceful, gentle man. But the Buddha was an intimidating presence. He was a force to be reckoned with. And he had lots of kind of nicknames, lots of epithets, including the Buddha. The Buddha was just a name people gave him, it wasn't his real name. And one of the names people gave him was Mahapurush, which means the big guy. So people called the Buddha the big guy, which I really like. It sounds a bit like a mafia name or something. The big cheese. And but basically the Buddha had a real presence, a really powerful presence. And that came from an integrated consciousness, all these different aspects of himself, really wholeheartedly behind whatever he was doing. And one other just story to illustrate that is, the Buddhist stories are full of kind of myth and legend and metaphor symbols. And there's one interesting story about a youth, a Brahmin youth, a Hindu youth, people often try to fool the Buddha, trick the Buddha, get one over him, make the Buddha look foolish, take him down a peg or two. And they never succeeded. And this particular youth was trying to make the Buddha look foolish. I think it was some kind of question about the Buddha's upbringing, the Buddha's clan. And the Buddha said to this youth, well, isn't it true that your family was descended from a slave? And this Brahmin youth just kind of shrank and was quite indignant and refused to answer the Buddha. He didn't want to answer the Buddha. So the Buddha asked him the same question again. Well, isn't it true your family descended from a slave? And the guy refused to answer again. And the tradition said if you refused the Buddha 3 times, well, you couldn't refuse the Buddha 3 times, the tradition said. So the 3rd time, the Buddha asked the same question. And the guy was about to refuse to answer, but said that a terrifying image appeared behind the Buddha, and it was an image of a figure called Vajrapani, who looks like quite an angry guy. He's kind of blue figure, he's huge, he's got huge arms, huge legs, he's wreathed in flames, he's wearing schools, and he's wielding a weapon which he was going to throw at this guy to split his head open if he didn't answer the Buddha's question. So you can take this, don't take this literally necessarily. But what I take this as is just a symbol of the presence, the same presence of the Buddha. This is another way of talking about this, the presence of the Buddha. You don't mess with the Buddha in a way. The Buddha wasn't somebody to be messed with. You could talk about assertiveness, but I don't think that really captures it. The full force of a spiritual consciousness, which is undiluted, really potent consciousness. Okay, so that's a glimpse of what can become, a fully integrated consciousness. But what about us? What's the kind of next steps for us? And once we start to know ourselves and we become aware of the different parts of ourselves, and you could say that we've become more of an individual. Vidanya framed it last week. At the first stage is about becoming an individual. So not blown about by events and moods, but we're able to consistently put ourselves behind something. So if we become an individual, what is next for us once we've started to become aware of the different parts of ourselves, become an individual? Well, the next stage is to become an individual that's motivated by positive emotion, by compassion, metta, gratitude. We need to become an individual that is connected to other people, a connected individual. So this is the second stage of the path, or the second aspect of the path, is positive emotion. So with this aspect, we're working with the law of karma, especially. So what we're doing here is we're strengthening positive emotions like gratitude and compassion, and we're weakening the so-called negative emotions. And the emotions that we call negative, unskillful emotions, we call them negative because they have a negative effect on us and other people. They cut us off from people, they're painful, they restrict us, they limit us. Whereas positive emotions we call positive emotions expand our consciousness, they connect us to other people, they cause us joy, happiness, pleasure for ourselves and other people. So we need to become a connected individual. And again, the Buddha, as well as sometimes being portrayed as a kind of meek doormat, he's also maybe sometimes unfairly portrayed as being a kind of cool, aloof individual, somebody who went away from the masses to be on his own, somebody who left his family, somebody who's kind of maybe selfish or kind of aloof. And that's the opposite of what the Buddha was, actually. The example of the Buddha, he taught and he exemplified compassion and love, kindness, generosity, gratitude. That it just kind of poured out of him. That's what the Buddha was. The Buddha was an embodiment of positive emotion, of compassion, of generosity, of gratitude. So just a few examples from the Buddha's life to illustrate this. So, the Buddha, he's become enlightened. He's had this huge life-changing experience which has ended suffering. Well, what he could have done is just basically put his feet up and thought, great, I'm not going to suffer anymore. That's me sorted. And that might have been quite tempting, actually, to the Buddha, potentially not to have to kind of engage with the whole mess of life, the whole kind of nonsense of life, all the suffering that's involved that people cause themselves, all the kind of crap in a way, just to kind of be away from it all. But the Buddha's immediate impulse, was to go and share what he'd learned, try and help other people. And that's what he spent the rest of his life from until the age of 90. He spent 60 odd years just walking barefoot around India, just sharing with anybody who wanted to hear what he'd learned, and basically rescuing lots of people, saving lots of people from suffering. And it said that he had a vision of people's potential. He could see that everybody, every human being, had the potential to become fully grown, fully awakened like himself, to fully evolve and become an enlightened human being. Every human being had the potential to grow and just achieve what he had achieved. And when it said that when he realised this, he physically trembled, he quivered. It's almost like he resonated with compassion with people. And he was moved to act, and he spent the rest of his life just trying to share with other people what he had learned, what he discovered. And we are benefiting from that today. So what can we do? Well, what we can do to develop positive emotion is just to begin to try and care for the people a bit more, to try and take an interest in people. That's the starting point. So the metta bhavana is the practice that is crucial for this. The practice of metta bhavana is where we begin to take an interest in people, to nurture and develop love for other people, compassion for other people, joy in other people's success. And it can be a difficult practice at times, but it's life-changing and heart-changing, so it's crucial. So we need to stick at that and become creative with that as well. And so there's a list here, so I might just say what the list is because I'm not written up. So I'll tell you the list and I'll go through it. So there's metta bhavana, friendship, rejoicing, gratitude, and the last one is what would the Buddha do? It doesn't quite fit into the list, but what would the Buddha do? So I'll just go through those. So we talked about metta bhavana. And the second is friendship. So the context to develop positive emotion is kind of the practice ground for positive emotion is friendship. And the Buddha just lived a life of simple friendship with his disciples, his attendants, the people he taught. He was another of his epithets was a friend to the world. He was the best friend to anybody he met. a friend to the world. And so in our own practice, when we're trying to cultivate positive emotion, we really place an emphasis on friendship in our community. The friendship is a context to develop love, to develop generosity. This brings me on to the third in this short list of rejoicing. Because last night I was with a group of friends in the Mitra group that I've just rejoined. And it was just a really lovely evening, actually, because we kind of tuned in with each other. We talked about what we've been doing over the last few weeks. And just spontaneously, people just started to rejoice in the other people in the group, just to talk about how much they've grown, how much they've developed since the group started. It was just a lovely evening, hearing kind of Gavin, who's not here, rejoicing in Pete and in Tansel and Dave, and everybody rejoicing in Dave, and people rejoicing in me and Majoressa. It was just a lovely evening of people rejoicing in each other. And that is an essential part of developing positive emotion, learning to see what's good in other people and rejoicing in it, kind of naming it, drawing it out. And it links to the next in the list of positive emotion for me, ways to develop positive emotion, which is gratitude. And the Buddha again exemplified this. He also exemplified rejoicing, but I'm going to go over time anyway, so I'm not going to talk about all the things. But the first thing the Buddha did after his enlightenment, one of the first things he did, was just to get up and bow to the tree that sheltered him whilst he was meditating. That's just, an astonishing thing to do, really, just to be great. The first thing that he did was to just express gratitude to the tree that he'd been leaning against whilst he was meditating. And then the second the second act that he did was to seek out the friends that had supported him over the last few years. He had 5 particular friends that had been helping him on his quest for enlightenment. And the first thing he did was to seek out, he just thought he was so grateful to these friends for supporting him, that they were the first people he wanted to tell, he wanted to share these this discovery with. So again, another aspect of the Buddha's positive emotion which we can really benefit from developing if we really want to grow is gratitude. And people have had experience of doing this on the intermediate course and different times throughout the centre maybe, which could really make that practice of just cultivating, contemplating who we were grateful for, what we were grateful for. And just that can be a really powerful way into metta and positive emotion. And then last but not least in this short list on positive emotion, ways to develop positive emotion, is what would the Buddha do? So you can bring to mind, if you want to cultivate a different way to act, a different way to behave, then you can ask yourself, what would the Buddha do in this situation? So, I look at these first 2 stages as closely connected with the gap, working with the gap. So it's almost like with integration, you're becoming aware of your habits. And with the second stage, positive emotion, you're choosing a creative response, something more ethical, a more positive emotional response. So if you're not sure what to do in a situation, you could use the example of the Buddha. If you know about some of the stories of the Buddha, and just think, okay, well, what would the Buddha do in this situation? And that can be a useful way into a creative, a positive response, the kind of response you're looking to cultivate. Okay. Very good. So you could see the first 2 stages. I've covered briefly the first 2 stages, but don't worry, because over the next few weeks we're going to go into much more detail about all of these. We're going to spend a few weeks on integration, a few weeks on all of the positive emotion, all of them. So I'm just touching the surface of them really. But you can see those first 2 stages as becoming a happy, healthy human being. Sometimes we talk in those terms, becoming a happy, healthy human being, which basically is what most of us want, isn't it? So what we all want is to become a happy, healthy human being. Most self-help books, most religions, try and give us that, to become a happy, healthy human being. And these first 2 stages, first 2 aspects, you could see it in that way. But from a Buddhist perspective, that is great, but it's not what Buddhism's about. And Buddhism's about much, much more than that. Becoming a happy, healthy human being is just a start. It's a start of something much more exciting and radical. So once we become an individual and we become a connected individual, Vidanya talked last week about how we need to then go beyond being an individual, beyond being a mere individual. And we need to die and be reborn as something else, something much more radical. So, we need to die, and we need to let go of our ideas about ourselves and reality. What needs to die is our views about ourselves, our limiting idea of who we are and what reality is. And if those die, if those drop away, something completely new is born and emerges. something very, very different. And these are the stages of spiritual death and rebirth, which we'll look at in much more detail. But yeah, when we're defined by our individuality, we are limited. We're limited by our likes, our dislikes, our conditioning. And we're a particular kind of person with particular background, particular ideas about the world, particular ideas about ourselves. There's things I can do, things I can't do. And we see the world from a particular perspective, a particular point of view, just through one set of eyes, maybe. But yeah, these stages of spiritual death and rebirth could be seen as the big breakthroughs that happen in the spiritual life, where there's a big shift in our identity, how we view the world. It transforms how we see the world and how we see ourselves. You could see it a bit like a snake shedding its skin, or a butterfly emerging from a caterpillar's cocoon. In the spiritual life, there's lots of experiences where who we thought we were dies, and something completely much more positive, much more beautiful emerges. So there needs to be that stage of transformation of the letting go, the dying of our identity, who we think we are, so that something completely radical, something very, we can't imagine can emerge, something much more positive can emerge. So when we're in the first two stages, when we're trying to practice the precepts, it's almost like we're making effort, we're trying to practice how the Buddha would behave. These 5 precepts are guidelines of how the Buddha would behave. But when the Buddha was enlightened, he didn't just try to be a connected person, he saw deeply that he was connected to other people. So his behaviour was just a natural expression of what he saw, of his vision, of his wisdom. He just saw deeply how connected he was to everything around him. So it was described as though the Buddha woke up. The Buddha described it himself as though he woke up from a dream. And this is where the nickname or the epithet of the Buddha came from. People started to call him the Buddha because it means the person who's woken up. So yeah, he described it to people as though it's just like we're all asleep. We don't see how things are. We don't see how we really are. We don't see how the world is. And this makes me think of the Matrix. I always like to think of the Matrix when I think about this. But the Buddha woke up into just a completely unimaginable way of seeing the world, seeing himself and seeing other people. So spiritual death is a stage of an aspect of seeing through wrong views, wrong ideas about ourselves and about reality. Another word for enlightenment is sometimes used, nirvana, and people might mistakenly think, well, the Buddha went to a different place. Nirvana was a place that the Buddha lived in. Actually, it's not a place or a rock band. Well, it was a rock band, but it's not from a Buddhist perspective. Nirvana is more, it's a state of mind. The Buddha saw, he had a massive breakthrough in how he saw things and saw himself. And what he dwelt in, it completely transformed the world that he dwelt in. He just saw the world and people around him completely differently. So he's in the same physical world to people, but in a completely different space, a completely different realm to other people. So spiritual death is associated with wisdom and vision and seeing things more clearly. But it involves a knowing, it's not a kind of rational knowing, it's a knowing that involves the head, the heart, and the intuition unified. So you can see how it needs the integration of positive emotion to be really, really developed and nurtured for this kind of really full knowing, a knowing of the heart as well as the mind and the intuition. So how can we cultivate this? We can have moments of vision, we can have moments of clarity, moments of wisdom even, where it's as though the kind of clouds part and we can just see things more clearly. But then the kind of clouds often kind of come back again and it's faded. And so we can experience things like sometimes in meditation we might experience that kind of clarity, that deeper wisdom. But also on a retreat sometimes we can just suddenly see things much more clearly. So one way to cultivate this is to put yourself in situations outside of your comfort zone, and in particular going on a retreat is a way of putting yourself outside of your comfort zone. So if you put yourself in new situations, unusual situations outside of your comfort zone, well, they'll challenge your usual way of operating, your usual way of thinking. It's almost like we are conditioned by our usual situation, and we put ourselves in a new situation, and it creates a space for something new to emerge. So, I'd emphasise retreats, going on retreats as a spiritual death practice. There can be. Well, I think Sangha actually used the term spiritual death deliberately. Well, he did use it deliberately, but why did he use spiritual death? Because it can have quite it has a strong impact, doesn't it? The idea of dying, something within us dying. But I think this side of transformation, it's quite scary. It can feel like we don't want it to happen. We really resist it. It's almost like the fear of death. We don't want it to happen. And we don't want the change, even if it's going to be something really, really positive, where we want our comfort zone, we want what we're familiar with, what we're comfortable with. So this side of change, there can be fear of the transformation, fear of change. So I think this term death, spiritual death, really captures, in a way, the fear, the resistance we have to change. But in a way, if we want a new, positive consciousness to emerge, then our existing consciousness, our existing ideas about ourselves and the world have to die. We have to let go of them. And that can be frightening, to let go of what is comfortable to us, what we cling to. And particularly what we talk about, what we cling to, is our sense of identity, our sense of ego. We sometimes talk about our ego sense, our ego clinging. But Vidanya mentioned last week, or he really highlighted last week, in the West it could be a dangerous approach to try and destroy the ego. People can tie themselves up in knots trying to destroy the ego or kind of see through the ego. And Sangharakshita has recommended it's a much healthier approach to try and have a sense of expanding your sense of self, to include concern for more and more people, to include concern for others, include concern for more and more other people, and concern for the whole world. So we approach spiritual death in this way, a sense of expanding concern for others, also putting ourselves outside of our comfort zone. That's just touching the surface on, again, a broad subject, and we're going to go into much more detail in a few weeks. So, spiritual death. But when our old ideas about ourselves die away, drop away, well, a new space opens up, a new space in our consciousness opens up, and it allows something different to emerge. So, we need to transcend our old self, and we need to become something new, something radically different. We need to be willing to let go of our old ideas of ourselves so something new can emerge. So this brings us on to kind of rebirth, which is, you could say, is the other side of the coin. We're going to look at spiritual death and rebirth together as the two sides of the same coin of transformation, two aspects of transformation. And we will have a series of transformations along the path where spiritual death and rebirth will be present in this way. There'll be a series of breakthroughs where it feels like something completely new shines through, just a whole new experience of yourself emerges. It almost feels like something outside of me is starting to shine through. But what I want to talk about is the Buddha again as the goal. The Buddha is the end of the path. The Buddha is the goal, the ideal. And during the Buddha's huge breakthrough, this enlightenment experience, when he experienced himself as just waking up to a whole new way of seeing things, any notion of selfishness just died. What it was that died, what spiritual death was really about, was just any notion of selfishness completely died in the Buddha. And he saw the emptiness of himself, the emptiness of everything around him. He saw the fullness of himself. He saw the fullness of everything around him. He saw the impermanence of everything. And he saw the unsatisfactoriness of a selfish, clinging way of life. So after the enlightenment experience, all of this had dropped away, and something very, very powerful, very striking, something almost transcendent, or something transcendental, something otherworldly, shone through the Buddha, radiated through the Buddha. It was almost like a potent mind. He was channeling a boundless love. Just this kind of energy was pouring out of the Buddha. He was just radiating something very, very powerful, very, very mysterious almost. And for people who encountered it, it can be something very, very powerful, very, very life-changing. So you could say in his enlightenment experience, the Buddha went beyond an ordinary human consciousness as we know it and can imagine it. Spiritual death proper, enlightenment, our idea about ourselves changes to such an extent. It seems as though something completely outside of us, something bigger and outside of ourselves, outside of me, is starting to flow through. And this is how it's described. And the kind of level I'm at, that's how, which is much. I've got a long way to go in terms of that, but I've got you can have a sense of there being something, an energy which is it doesn't feel like me, something outside of me that can be experienced, tapped into. So there's an interesting story when the Buddha, just recently after he'd been enlightened, and so one of the first few people to encounter the Buddha was a person who just happened to pass the Buddha and was just really, I guess, just struck by this, you could say, awe, for want of a better word, this kind of presence of the Buddha, the effect of the Buddha, this kind of, this very, very powerful presence of the Buddha. And it's almost like the Buddha was glowing, the Buddha was radiating with love, with compassion, with wisdom. And he just wanted to know, he was curious, he wanted to know what the Buddha was, who the Buddha was. It's just something beyond what he'd experienced before. So he asked the Buddha, well, are you a god? Are you some kind of god or something? And the Buddha said, no, I'm not a god. He said, oh, well, are you a human then? And the Buddha said, well, no, I'm not a human. So that kind of freaked the guy out a bit. He said, okay, well, and in Indian kind of culture, mythology, there's lots of different classes of beings. So he said, well, are you a yaksha, a raksha, a naga, all these different kind of mythical beings? And the Buddha said, no, I'm not any of them. And so the Buddha said, well, I'm enlightened being, an enlightened human being. So it's almost like the Buddha had changed so much, he'd been kind of reborn into something so different that his consciousness was no longer an ordinary human consciousness. It was almost like a new category needed to be invented for the Buddha's consciousness. So, the Buddha was channeling, this is the way I describe it, it's maybe not traditional, but the Buddha was channeling something. It's almost like the Buddha was radiating an energy, a force. It's almost like a potential in the universe, and the Buddha was just manifesting it, just kind of radiating this potential for change, for growth. Very, very positive. And ultimately it's mysterious. We can't, this side of enlightenment, we can't really know the Buddha. But in a sense, there's something within us that is connected to us, something within us. You could say there's a strand in us which is connected to that enlightenment experience of the Buddha. There's something within our consciousness which resonates with and connects with the enlightenment of the Buddha. And it's as though there's something in us which resonates with what's ultimate and highest in the universe, with the enlightened mind. And we can put ourselves in... Sorry, that's the wrong page. Bear with me. We can experience it. We can experience it, I think, as an atmosphere sometimes at this Buddhist Centre. You can experience a hugely positive atmosphere at this Buddhist Centre, which just you don't experience in other situations, in other places. In Buddhist rituals, sometimes I get a sense of this very, very positive atmosphere or energy. Next week we're going to be doing a Buddhist ritual, so you'll get a chance, if you've not done that before, to maybe see what that experience is like. But you could say we've got a thread which connected me as I am now to me as I could be, my higher self. It's as though you could see it as though there's a higher self, my enlightened self, and me as I am now. And there's a thread connecting me as I am now to the enlightened mind, this kind of, mysterious, powerful energy. And we can do practices that engage us with this energy, encourage what's potential in us to emerge, to emerge. And one of the practices is to contemplate the Buddha, to contemplate images of the Buddha. So this is the area of working practically with spiritual rebirth. We can encourage what is potential within us to emerge. And I've deliberately put this, asked for this picture to be displayed here because just by contemplating an image of the Buddha or the example of the Buddha, stories of the Buddha, in a way it can communicate to us at a kind of deep level. It can communicate to our depths, not just to our rational mind. In a way, what I've tried to been saying for the last 35 minutes, I've been trying to communicate all these different aspects of the Buddha and the path. But you could just look at this image, and if you're really receptive to this image, you could, some of these same qualities start to emerge. And this happens time after time on our intermediate classes. People talk about integration. They talk about how the ground, the Buddha's really connected to the ground, but at the same time is really connected to his heights. The heights as well as the depths. People talk about the kind of blurring between self and other, the kind of blurring between the edges of the Buddha. People talk about the kind of almost like the Buddha connected to something cosmic with the kind of vision of the universe, the world behind the Buddha, and this kind of third eye in his head almost. And almost like the Buddha's radiating something. The Buddha's expressing something, radiating something very, very potent, very powerful. So I've been trying to express that in words, not very well for the last half an hour or so, but it might have been better just to show this image at the start and say, look at this image for half an hour. because that, an image of the Buddha can communicate, can convey, the qualities of enlightenment, the qualities of the enlightened mind, and it can stir in our depths, it can stir within us those potentials. It can start to stir them and draw them out in us. And this is the practices of spiritual rebirth associated with connecting with images of enlightenment, figures associated with enlightenment, and allowing those to draw out those potentials within us. So there's a story of a disciple of the Buddha called Pingiya, who we'll hear about, I'm sure, in a few weeks' time again. But very briefly, Pingiya was old and couldn't move about very much, but he really, really loved the Buddha. He was really, really devoted to the Buddha. The Buddha had changed his life. And one day he went back and he bumped into his old teacher, who was a Hindu teacher. And he was kind of he was kind of telling this Hindu teacher how great the Buddha was, what a fantastic teacher the Buddha was. And the Hindu teacher might have been a little bit miffed because he might have been inferring from that, implying he's a better teacher than he was. So the teacher replied, "Well, why aren't you with him now? If he's such a great teacher, if he kind of knows everything and he's transformed your life, why aren't you with him now?" And Pingiya replied, "Well, I am with him now. In my imagination, I bring the Buddha to mind, and it's as clear as seeing him with my eyes. I just basically spend all my time with the Buddha. I imagine the Buddha, and I'm with him all the time. So I'm old, and I can't follow him around, but I spend all my time with the Buddha, revering the Buddha in his presence." And that story is really, really crucial for us. It's a really important story for us, because if Pingiya could do it, then we could do it. Pingiya wasn't physically in the same place as the Buddha, but yet it was as though he was in the Buddha's presence just by bringing him to mind. So a bit like before when I said, well, what would the Buddha do? In different situations, if you've got a really strong connection with the Buddha, or you're in contact with your own deeper potentials, your own higher qualities, your own enlightened self, which is wanting to emerge, the enlightened mind, which is potential within you. So if you're walking around in the presence of the Buddha, well, that's going to have quite an effect on you. If you're sitting on the bus and the Buddha's next to you, you're going to have quite a different bus ride to if you're just sitting on the bus thinking unskillful thoughts in a way. So you might find yourself acting more like the Buddha if you're imaginatively connecting with the Buddha in this way. So we're going to do a puja next week, a Buddhist ritual, and that's one of the ways that Buddhists actively engage with the ideal of the Buddha, the goal of the Buddha, bring the Buddha to mind, and spend time dwelling on the Buddha. And this is why we do it, because we're trying to draw forth within what's potential within us. We're trying to bring out our own potential for boundless love, for compassion, for wisdom. So that's why we engage with these practices. So we'll find out more about that next week. So if we've got a thread connecting, if I've got a thread connecting me as I am now, with my kind of limited mind and my unskillful thoughts, if there's a thread connecting with me to the enlightened mind, what's ultimate in the universe, what to do with that, and what can I do with that? Well, what we can do is we can set up conditions which will help to invite our higher self. It's almost like you can invite the enlightened mind by setting up conditions. You can invite your own potential. I think that's an effective way of seeing it, and we'll look at that in the puja next week as well. You can see it in terms of setting up the conditions to bring forth your higher self. So we need to make space in our consciousness for something new to emerge, perhaps even something transcendental, something of the enlightened mind to emerge. And this is the area of receptivity. When our mind is more receptive, it's as though we can hear the voice of our higher self, the voice of a kind of wiser self. So when my mind is clear and I'm more receptive, it's like there's a wiser Bodhinaga who knows really what I should be doing. And when I'm in a less good state and my mind's kind of busy and cluttered, it's difficult to hear that voice, the voice of a kind of wiser me. So we can create a space in our consciousness where we're more receptive to that wisdom, to that inner wisdom, our higher self. And that's this area of receptivity. And there's a couple of images that help me. It's almost like I can relate to it as though there's a sun. It's like a sun calling a plant to grow. We've got this image of growth, the spiritual path being us human beings growing. Well, you could imagine, the plants need a sun, which kind of tells them what direction to grow in. nourishes them and warms them. It's almost like I can relate to the enlightened mind in that way, actually. And Sangharakshita has described it as though there's been a wind blowing him or blowing through him. He described it as though he set up this movement, but the experience to him was as though something set up this movement, set up this tradition through him. It's just like he was in the right place at the right time, and there's this energy wanting to set up a Buddhist movement. So he described it as though there's a wind blowing through us. And sometimes, it might not be that there's a wind blowing through us, but we might feel a breeze, just a kind of a waft or something. But we can set up the conditions to make that stronger, to make that experience stronger in our lives, the call, the urge to grow. So we need to, there's another small list, we need to create spaces in our life, with pauses in our busy life. And the second thing is we need to cultivate a stillness of being, a stillness in our heart and a stillness in our mind. And the third thing we need to do is to create spaces in our self-importance through reverence. We need to create gaps in our self-importance through revering other things, through reverence. So firstly, we need to, working with spiritual receptivity, there needs to be gaps in our busy life. If we're kind of constantly striving, constantly making effort, there's never a chance for the kind of fruits to emerge. There's never a chance for new things to bubble through. So we need to create gaps and spaces in our lives. And what occurred to me this week was that it's when I'm really trying to remember something and I've forgotten it, the more I try to remember it, I can't remember it. It's only when I stop trying to remember it and I go and do something else, it just occurs to me, it comes up in my mind. And it's the same with the spiritual life and meditation and ethics. You make lots and lots of effort, but you also need to have times where there's pauses and spaces and quiet in your life and in your mind for the fruits to emerge, for something new to bubble up. If we're constantly busy, our mind is constantly full, our life is constantly full. Well, there's never the gap, there's never the space for something new to bubble up. So we need to have time when we're not doing anything. We need to have spaces in our lives. And for me, there's a couple of incidents from the Buddha's life, the Buddha's enlightenment, that illustrate this. I'm just going to talk about the second one. So the second one is that after the Buddha's enlightenment, he just sat for a long period of time. Sometimes it's a week, some accounts say a week, some accounts say a couple of weeks, some accounts say longer. The Buddha basically just sat, did nothing. So he had this huge breakthrough in his life, and his response was just to basically sit there and do nothing. And I think I can understand, I can't fully understand why, but I think I can appreciate why. It's like you've got to digest your food in a way, you've got to digest your spiritual experience. If you had such a huge, life-changing, shattering experience, well, I think you're just going to probably just to sit there, just trying to absorb it really, just trying to take it all in. And that's what the Buddha did for a period of weeks after his enlightenment experience. And in a kind of small way, what we try and do at the end of meditation experience, our meditation practices here, is something just to mirror that. We try and just do nothing. Just for a minute, even 2 minutes at the end of our meditation, we just say, we'll just sit. And the idea is you don't try and do anything. You don't try and meditate, you don't try not to meditate. You don't try and do anything, you just sit there. And what that allows is for the fruits, the kind of consequences, the positive benefits of your meditation just to emerge, just to flow. And this is part of the spiritual receptivity aspect. You need to have space for that to bubble up. So stillness at the end of a practice is really important. And for me, the best moments of stillness come at the end of puja, at the end of ritual. So again, we're going to do a ritual next week, and you'll experience this. But right at the end of a puja, there's those 3 shantis. We have these 3 words that we repeat, shanti. We chant at the end of the puja. It means peace. It doesn't mean an ordinary peace. It means a complete peace, a kind of transcendental peace. And we chant that 3 times, and at the end of the puja, there's just stillness, there's just silence, and nobody moves. If it's a really good puja, sometimes for minutes, there's complete stillness, nobody moves, and no shuffling. And it's as though my kind of being is still, my mind is still, my heart is still. There's just a complete stillness. And, that's another example. We need those kind of moments of stillness and peace in our practice. And then thirdly, finally, we need to create spaces in our self-importance. So if we're trying to radically change our view of the world and ourselves, to see ourselves as more connected to other people, well, part of integration will be starting to realise that we actually regard ourselves as very, very important, actually much more important than other people. We are the centre of the world and the universe, and things should be how we want them to be. And we need to, in Buddhism, reverence is seen as a really important state of mind. If there's nothing that you revere, you're stuck. If you revere only yourself, if you think only yourself is what's important, which is unfortunately in our culture common for a lot of people, we revere ourselves. And it's almost like an unfashionable state of mind to revere somebody else. But the Buddha, after his enlightenment, he was in that predicament. He was, after his enlightenment, it said that he reflected and thought, well, actually, if people don't revere, they suffer. It causes you suffering not to revere. But he looked around, imagined something, and thought, well, there's no human being I could revere. There's nobody, I can't imagine anybody, there isn't anybody who's achieved what I've achieved. So there's a bit of a paradox for the Buddha. But his way out of it was that he would revere the Dharma, he would revere the truth, he would revere the teachings. That was what he would revere. And I think what's crucial from that story is that the importance of reverence and, in a way, how unfashionable it can be in our culture to revere another person. Almost uncomfortable it can be, the idea of revering somebody. But again, it's a practice it's part of the practice of Buddhist ritual and puja that we'll be looking at next week is that we revere the Buddha. We don't revere him as a god, we don't worship him as a god, but we revere his consciousness, his state of mind, and it's a state of mind that we want. We want to cultivate, we want to develop for ourselves. And it may be, for people new to Buddhism, in a way that might not be that relevant because you don't know a lot about the Buddha. It's unlikely that you'll revere somebody you've never heard about or don't know much about, and that's, I think, sensible probably. You're unlikely to revere somebody you don't have an emotional connection with, don't know much about, but in a way, look for people that you can revere, things that you can revere, because what's important, the state of reverence is crucial. If we think we are the bee's knees, we're stuck. If we think we're the pinnacle, it'd be what a travesty if I was the pinnacle of humanity, or in a sense, if any one of us was. What's possible for us is something much, much more radical, much, much more positive than what any of us is currently, I expect, experiencing right now. So I think, in the puja we can experience all 5 of the aspects of the spiritual path, because we can, in the puja, you commit with, you're doing a practice with your body, speech and mind. So it's the whole of your being is brought into the ritual. And also, in every puja I come up against the bits of me that don't want to practice, bits there'll be a voice saying in my head, what a load of nonsense, what a load of rubbish, what am I doing this for? It really brings you up against the bits of yourself that are unintegrated behind the path. So puja is a really integrating practice. But it's also a practice of developing love and gratitude. So it's a practice of positive emotion, and it's a practice of wisdom, because right in the heart of the puja we chant what's called the Heart Sutra, the heart of Buddhist wisdom. And it's a practice of bringing to mind the Buddha or enlightenment. So it's a rebirth and receptivity practice. So I'll end there by way of neatly linking to the puja next week, and just end by saying, I am grateful and revere the example set by the Buddha, and I really aspire towards it. I'm really grateful to the example of the Buddha and the life of the Buddha. And I suppose what I revere is a consciousness that's fully integrated, really potent and vibrant, a powerful presence like the gaze of an elephant. Deeply compassionate consciousness, which a man who lived his life to share his teaching with other people, and just through simple friendship, lived his life through simple friendship. And I revere a mind that is fully awake to reality, and a consciousness that transcends the dualities of self and other, transcends the limitations of space and time even. And I'll just end with a verse from the threefold puja, which is, what the Buddha overcame, we too can overcome. And what the Buddha attained, we too can attain. So I'll say that again. What the Buddha overcame, we too can overcome. And what the Buddha attained, we too can attain. Thank you.